Hi there, Steve Kaufman here again. You're going to hear my wife working on her scales. She's so excited. She downloads these things from the internet. I mean, she wouldn't go to a teacher, but she can find stuff on the internet that's really helping her, and she plays hours a day, and she's just loving it. So we have that as background music to our videos here. So to continue in the series about how I went about learning languages, I think I'm going to try to combine French and Spanish because they both kind of came at me at the same time in my life, and they were really quite instrumental to the whole issue of me getting involved with language learning. So here I was in Montreal. Montreal in the 1950s was what they called the two solitudes. You had 1 million English-speaking people and 2 million French-speaking people, and the workplace was English. In the stores, everything was English. So you, as an English-speaking person growing up in Montreal, it was really not very different from living in Toronto or Chicago, insofar as languages were concerned. And of course, we had French in school, starting in grade 2, and we had the 16 verbs that take être, and it was like we studied it to pass the exam, and I did well. I mean, I did fairly well at school, and I did just as well in French as I did in the other subjects, and I wasn't that interested. I went to McGill University in Montreal, and we had a professor, Maurice Rabotin was his name, and he was just excellent. Excellent because he made French civilization, French culture interesting. Everything they did in school made it uninteresting. Whereas he, whether it was him or the environment of being at university or the textbook, and I still remember it had these lovely pictures of paintings, by Watteau or whoever it was, of the different, eras of French culture and civilization that we were studying. But all of a sudden it became interesting, and at that same time I became interested in the sort of movies of the Nouvelle Vague, I think it was called, can't remember the actresses in those days, but once, as a teacher, you have only one job, is to turn on the student. Easier said than done. Once the student is turned on, you don't need the teacher. And so I not only enjoyed what I was studying in class, and we had to read different books, and it was just fascinating discovering Voltaire and Rousseau and Manon Lescaut, and all the books. And I like traditional literature, I have to say, Balzac and so forth. And then I started reading the local newspaper, Le Devoir, and of course in Quebec at that time, it was at the time when all of this, the fervor, the ferment, where the Quebec wanted to be maître chez nous because the economy was controlled by the English. And even though the Québécois, I mean, they were the largest group, they controlled the provincial politics, but it was corrupt. It was, the church had a tremendous influence. Quebec was the only province in Canada that didn't have a provincial ministry of education. They let the church run the education. So they had lots of notaries and priests. And so this was all changed by this sort of the young Turks, Jean Lesage, of course Pierre Trudeau was part of that group, although he ended up being more interested in federal politics. René Lévesque, who was eventually the leader of the separatists, all this stuff was going on. So it was very interesting to read about it in the newspaper and go and see French theater, even if I didn't understand it. It was my French period, so I got totally into it. And as I say, once you're motivated, it's easy enough to learn. And I ended up going to France, where I lived for 3 years. And I described in the other video how I found work on a German freighter going across to Europe. Then I hitchhiked all over Europe that summer and ended up in Grenoble, and eventually moved over to political science. And then I went for 2 years to Paris, to the l'Institut d'études politiques, and got my diploma there. And I had 3 wonderful years in France as a student. I lived in Paris. I had a bicycle. I lived on the 5th floor of a building that was built in 1789. The bathroom wasn't a bathroom, but the toilet was on the 3rd floor. I had a big basin that I would fill with water, like I bought it, a big aluminum tub that I would sit in to wash myself. You know, cold in the winter, and but fantastic. So I had a great time, and that obviously was very good for my French, because everything I had to do in French. So, and that convinced me that I could transform myself into someone that could comfortably speak another language, because until you've done that, you don't believe you can do it. And part of the problem language learners have is they can't really visualize themselves fluently speaking another language. So it's like climbing a mountain where you don't know where the peak is, and you don't think you can reach the peak. And that's a major problem that many language learners have who have never ever learned a second language. So French was a big deal for me. Now, insofar as Spanish, I had a course at McGill in Spanish. That was one of the sort of electives that I took one year. And fortunately, the professor, they got us right into reading stories right away. That's what we did. We didn't spend our time in class role-playing and talking to each other and playing games and making, you know, slideshows and all the stuff that they seem to do now. We just, here's a book, has a glossary, read it. And I remember it was a, you know, there was, I can't remember what the name of these stories were, but they took place in Valencia, or they took place wherever it took place. And we read them and accumulated vocabulary, and it was painstaking, but that was the course, and I passed it. But I got interested in Spanish, and there were a lot of, you know, people who had fought on the Republican side in the Spanish Civil War who lived in Montreal, and there was a cafe there called La Asociación Española, and they sat there playing dominoes, and I'd wander in there, you know, and I thought I was a really cool guy, 18 years old, and I'd order you know, a drink and watch all these Spanish guys play domino and hear them swearing in Spanish and stuff. But then, when I arrived in France, I used to hitchhike every holiday, every chance I get, and the favorite destination was Spain. So I'd go into what was then Franco's Spain, and I tell you, the people were, I mean, I like Spain today, but Spain in those days was unbelievable. People were so friendly. You know, foreigners were a rarity. The first night I arrived in Barcelona, I was on a bus going out to the youth hostel, and I started talking to people and bumbling in my Spanish. You got to come to the bar and drink, and you sit around and you're pouring wine out of this container that has a great big spout and whatever. And so I would hitchhike a lot in Spain, and hours and hours and hours of sitting with truck drivers and other people who picked me up gave me a lot of chance to speak Spanish. So I kind of had that, and with the French vocabulary, and even coming from English, a lot of the words are of Latin origin. But so I had this sort of bumbling acquaintance with Spanish. But going to Spain in more recent years, I decided I'd really try to improve it. And I always think that when you're learning any language, a major point is when you have read your first book. And I'm not talking about reading like on the computer with online dictionaries. I mean, you're reading it, ignoring the words you don't know and reading it. And the first book that I read was called, in Spanish, and I read it maybe 6-7 years ago. It's called El Bosque Originario by Jon Juaristu, who I believe is Basque, I'm not sure, but he writes about, you know, all the myths of origin of different peoples in Europe. And it's a subject that fascinates me because I like that subject. You know, I like this whole idea of people with their myths of origin. I believe a lot of this sort of identity and ethnic identity is largely imaginary, and it's largely elective, and you can choose to belong to whichever group you want to belong to. So it was a fascinating book. And so if you are interested in the subject, then you can read through it. I remember going back to German, the first book that I really read from cover to cover in German was written by the former president there, Weizsäcker, and it was about the environment. I read it on a plane. 8 hours on a plane is a great place to read, by the way. You got nothing else to do. No one to bother you. So, and then subsequent to that, I just happened to look through my library here. A book that I really enjoyed was La Sombra del Viento by Carlos Ruiz Zafón. Because I spent so much time in Barcelona, when I was hitchhiking. A wonderful time there. I'd buy a Spanish guitar. I'd buy my 2 bottles of Fundador, cheap brandy, which I would keep in my room in Paris. So yeah, reading, and then you know, I wish I could do more to improve my Spanish. I just haven't had time. I have done a couple of the audiobooks at Link, Parezca dos. I think one was, I can't remember, but they're historical novels. They're very, very nice, and we have the LibriVox versions at Link, so I've gone through trying to upgrade my vocabulary and listen. Also, when I was in Spain, again, 4 or 5 years ago, I discovered this Grupo Risa of the COPE radio station, who are very funny. COPE happens to be on the right wing, you know, Catholic conservative side of things, but I'm always interested in the language, basically, and they're quite funny. So, yeah, you know, again, French has been a big part of my life because I spent those 3 years there. I love going there. But I mean, I like everywhere that I go. I mean, Japan, where we lived for 9 years, we always are nostalgic. Wherever you've been and learnt the language, it's great fun, as is the case with Spain. I'm trying to remember if there's anything else with regard to Spanish. Yeah, you know, I keep emphasizing this reading thing. Now, some people don't like to read. They like to watch TV. Fine. You got to do what you like, I think. And I always emphasize that in language learning. You got to like the language. You got to like what you're doing. You got to put in the time. But reading, in terms of building up your vocabulary, is just, it's the most effective way of building up your vocabulary. And then, when you are confronted with the need, as was the case with me in Spain, to speak, you know, slowly, the words start to come out, and you hear them, and you relate to what you read, and so you build up your vocabulary. And if you have a vocabulary, I believe you will, and if you're attentive to the language and try to listen to how things are pronounced, you will learn to speak. So the biggest, and as I've said many times, it's the same with literacy in your own language. Reading is key. I look at my grandchildren, and if they're reading a lot, which they are, I'm happy. Because whatever else happens in their schoolwork, if they read well, they'll do fine. And the same is true in language learning. So I kind of did French and Spanish together because I didn't have that much original to say about them. And I will try to get into, we've had people ask me for Portuguese, Russian, and maybe Czech. Why did I bother with Czech? So there you have it. Thank you for listening. Bye for now.